Hello everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, The Political Report. For today's video, I wanted to give a preview on tonight's runoff primary elections happening in the state of Georgia and a tad bit of an overview on the runoff election occurring in the state of Alabama toward the end of the video. To get started, on your screen here, you can actually see the New York Times page where they're actually counting and showing the poll closing times for the runoff elections in the state of Georgia. So here on your screen, you can see that there are only 2 statewide runoff elections left in the state of Georgia that's occurring today. So once polls close tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, you can see that there will be results for the U.S. Senate Republican primary runoff and results for the U.S. gubernatorial Republican primary runoff in the state of Georgia. Now for the U.S. Senate side, we have incumbent U.S. House of Representatives member Mike Collins and Brian Kemp acolyte Derek Dooley running for the final spot as who will lead the Republican Party in the U.S. Senate slot for this November election. And for the gubernatorial election, we have Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones against multi-billionaire Rick Jackson, a former healthcare executive. These are the 2 runoffs that's going to be hotly contested and within a margin of error tonight. So you can see here on your screen that Trump actually decided to make his endorsement known in the U.S. Senate race very close to the runoff elections, as only in the past few days, Trump decided to endorse incumbent U.S. House of Representatives member Mike Collins in the Georgia Senate race. And this is a endorsement in clash of Brian Kemp's endorsement. Now, Brian Kemp is the incumbent governor of the state of Georgia, and he previously decided not to run for this U.S. Senate seat. Now, if you actually go to the 2026 U.S. Senate election here on Wikipedia for the state of Georgia, you can see that all of the hypothetical polling, if Brian Kemp decided to run for the U.S. Senate seat, showed Brian Kemp beating Democratic incumbent Jon Ossoff by healthy margins in virtually every single poll. From 4 different pollsters, they all show Brian Kemp winning by anywhere from 6 points all the way to 7 points depending on the poll. So Brian Kemp had a guaranteed win here against Jon Ossoff, one of the most popular and overperforming Democratic incumbents in the state of Georgia. And this really would have been a free and easy win for Republicans in the state if the governor decided to run for election in the U.S. Senate here. However, Brian Kemp decided not to run, and instead he endorsed one of his acolytes, Derek Dooley. Now, Derek Dooley is a former head coach for the Tennessee Volunteers football team, and he really doesn't have any political or statewide experience in the state of Georgia himself. But nonetheless, Brian Kemp decided to endorse Derek Dooley along with his wife, the First Lady of Georgia, and Derek Dooley ended up coming second in the primary. He came in second with 30% of the vote, when Mike Collins garnered around 40% of the vote. And of course, the person who ended up being the 3rd place candidate here was Buddy Carter, another U.S. House of Representatives member who ended up tallying around 25.1% of the vote. And you can see here pretty much all of his votes came from the easternmost part of the state of Georgia, which is where his district is represented. But since neither candidate got 50% of the vote, this is headed toward a runoff. Now, for the runoff polling, you can actually see here on your screen that they have conducted at least 6 polls since the primary has actually occurred, specifically for the runoff elections here. And you can see that in all 6 of these polls, Mike Collins is leading by a healthy amount. Now, initially by Quantus Insights, you can see that he was leading from anywhere from 18 to 17, more recently to only around 2 points. So a lot of the more recent polls from Insider Advantage in specific show this actually being a close race, whereas every single other poll conducted earlier in the runoff cycle shows Mike Collins winning by a comfortable margin. However, all of these still show Mike Collins within the lead, and when you include the undecided voters that probably voted for Buddy Carter, they're much more likely to lean toward Mike Collins compared to Derek Dooley. So I think here in this race, this is very obviously going to be a Mike Collins victory. Now, the only thing that's up for debate here is what's the margin going to be. The margin could be anywhere from, the 2 points that the polls are projecting to actually be the correct margin, or a lot more. Now, I personally think that the margin here would be closer to around 5 percentage points, but maybe all the way to around 10 percentage points that Mike Collins will end up winning. Now, the reason behind this, once again, is because a lot of the Buddy Carter voters and a lot of the other voters for these 2 lesser-known candidates are probably going to coalesce around Mike Collins toward the end. And there is a reason that Trump decided to make his endorsement here in the last few days of the race in the state of Georgia. to make sure that Mike Collins has enough votes and enough undecideds to make it to the finish line. Now, it's not just me thinking that, but if you actually go to the betting markets and the odds, they pretty much all show Mike Collins having a guaranteed victory here, where you can see on the day right before the primary that Derek Dooley was actually polling above Mike Collins heading into the U.S. Senate primary election. However, once Derek Dooley drastically underperformed the polls and Mike Collins ended up winning the majority of the primary vote by 40 to 30 compared to Derek Dooley, you can see that the odds basically flipped overnight. And since then, Mike Collins has really been running away with it in the polling markets, where bettors are betting more than $1.2 million and projecting to give Mike Collins a 96% chance of winning this U.S. Senate election here. So not only is it my own personal opinion that I think Mike Collins will be winning this race here by a comfortable margin of close to around maybe 5 to 10 percentage points, but it seems to be the general consensus betting wide that Mike Collins is heavily favored here to win. So this race really isn't going to be that competitive, I don't think, at the end of the day, despite what the most recent polls might say. Now, a lot of this does not really matter because if you look at Mike Collins or Derek Dooley polling off against Jon Ossoff, neither of these candidates have a chance of beating Jon Ossoff to begin with. Now, if you go to Jon Ossoff, you can literally see that he has raised over $77.9 million just on his own personal campaign trail, while Republicans here are still fighting all the way in the middle of June just to see who their candidate is. Now, Jon Ossoff is so rich, he's such a popular incumbent, and this is the state of Georgia, and what is going to be a Democrat-leaning midterm environment, that whichever one of these candidates here are basically dead on arrival when they go to the general election against Jon Ossoff. However, the question here is, what's the margin going to be? If you get Derek Dooley, it might be an 8-point loss, whereas if you get Mike Collins, it might be a 6-point loss, which still isn't a good margin. But when it comes to some of these other statewide races, such as the governor's race, attorney general's race, secretary of state's race, the margin here of the Senate candidate could actually come into play, where if you get Mike Collins, it's probably not going to be as bad as if you get Derek Dooley to run. So that's it for the Senate election. Now moving on to the governor's election. Now you can see here for the gubernatorial bid that the candidates actually are Rick Jackson and Burt Jones. So as mentioned before, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones is facing off against multi-billionaire healthcare executive Rick Jackson. Now, Rick Jackson was actually the heavy favorite at some point in this election. However, Rick Jackson ended up drastically underperforming the polls. If you go to the 2026 primary election here, you can see that Rick Jackson was actually leading all of the polls by around 3.5 percentage points with 27% undecided. And more recently, in the most recent polls right before the election, it showed Rick Jackson up by around 4 to 5 points compared to Burt Jones. However, on election day, you can see here that Burt Jones actually ended up overperforming and winning by around 6 percentage points compared to Rick Jackson. Now, since the Republican primary occurred and heading into the runoff elections, you can see that some of the more rhino and or establishment candidates in the state of Georgia and nationwide have decided to back Rick Jackson. Now, Rick Jackson received an endorsement from Ted Cruz and Chris Carr, who is the Attorney General of Georgia. Now, the endorsement from Ted Cruz is probably more likely to hurt him than help him. However, Chris Carr did end up getting around 12% of the vote here. So you might assume, okay, these Chris Carr voters, a lot of them will probably be backing Jackson because that's who their candidate decided to endorse. Whereas Burt Jones actually received a much more important and valuable endorsement in the state of Georgia. Now, usually Brian Kemp and Donald Trump are at odds when it comes to their endorsements and their future for the candidates in the state of Georgia. However, on this rare occasion, they ended up coalescing behind Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who was seen as more of a MAGA candidate here in this race. You can see here that Brian Kemp, just days before the runoff election actually occurred, decided to endorse Burt Jones, his lieutenant governor, in the state of Georgia, in contrast to Ted Cruz endorsing Rick Jackson instead. You can see here Brian Kemp actually made the argument that Burt Jones was more electable since he has already won statewide and a lieutenant gubernatorial election in the state of Georgia, and as his own lieutenant governor, so he probably has a bigger preference to him just with that reason itself. Now, if you go to the actual polling, since the primary election occurred, you can see that they have runoff polling. Now, in this runoff polling, you can see here that Burt Jones was initially in the lead by a few percentage points, anywhere from 2 to 6 percentage points. However, once Chris Carr ended up endorsing Rick Jackson, and you can see that some of these polls actually showed a 50-50 race, turning into somewhat of a Rick Jackson lead, where Rick Jackson was leading by around 2 percentage points, and then this one poll shows him up by 12. Now, that one poll is a huge outlier because there hasn't been a single race above 6 percentage points here out of all of these polls, but there's one signal poll that shows him up 12, which you can probably just, throw away as being an outlier, where everything else kind of shows this being a 6-point race in either direction for Burt Jones and for Rick Jackson, where in the most recent polling, they're nearly at a virtual tie by insider advantage, showing it being a 48 to 47% race here. You can actually see here in this description by insider advantage that it says, due to Brian Kemp's endorsement, they decided to make a last-minute poll here. And you can actually see that the margin went down from 3% to virtually less than 1%, where Rick Jackson is projected to lead, with 5% undecided. Now, because of the Brian Kemp endorsement in the state, at the very last minute before this runoff election, you can see here that the momentum will probably be behind Burt Jones, the lieutenant governor here. Now, when it comes to my prediction for this primary, I think that Burt Jones will end up winning this race. However, I think it will be a lot closer than the Senate race. I think Burt Jones will end up winning by around 5 percentage points. Now, the reasoning behind that is that he is able to unite the MAGA wing of the Georgia Republican Party. He has Donald Trump's endorsement, and he was able to squeak out an endorsement from Brian Kemp, the incumbent governor of Georgia, at the very last minute, compared to Rick Jackson. And Rick Jackson, a lot of his campaign has just been the fact that he's a billionaire and he's able to, buy out all of the advertising and the media markets in the state. And some people in the state might be annoyed because at some point when there's too much advertising or too much campaign by a certain candidate, it actually has the opposite effect of what some people might think, where some people are actually annoyed of seeing the same candidate and the same advertisements 24/7, and they presume that they are being bought out by the candidate, which Rick Jackson does happen to be doing here. Now, the candidate here is actually a lot more important, because the candidate here will be facing off against Keisha Lance Bottoms in the general election. Now you can see here, Keisha Lance Bottoms is actually projected to win by around 10 to 12 percentage points. However, nobody really buys any of this as being true. The polls here are very, very inaccurate, as there's virtually no shot any Democrat wins a statewide election in the state of Georgia by more than 10 points. Now, the reason I say this is because the pundits are virtually all in alignment as labeling this as a tilt or a toss-up race here, with the pundits actually labeling this as a tilt Republican race here for the gubernatorial election. Now, the reason is because although Georgia might be close on a federal level when it comes to the U.S. Senate elections or the U.S. presidential elections, at least in their statewide elections, Georgia has consistently been won by the Republicans. When it comes to the state legislature, in their Senate and their House elections, or when it comes to the Georgia governor's election, alongside all of the other statewide races such as Attorney General, Secretary of State, Agricultural Commissioner, and Lieutenant Governor, all of them have gone Republican for pretty much the last 2.5 decades in a row, despite the presidential and Senate elections going to the Democrats in very, very close margins. On a statewide level, this still does seem to be a Republican state. You can even see here that on the leftist Vote Hub projections here, where they have a lot of a leftward Democratic slant here, they actually show that Georgia is more favored to tilting toward the Republicans here compared to Keisha Lance Bottoms. Now, Keisha Lance Bottoms is going to make this a somewhat of a close race. However, the fact that the polls show her leading by double digits, yet pretty much every pundit and actual data knows for a fact she's not in the lead, just shows that she has a lot of room to fall, despite this heavy boost from these very slanted and inaccurate polls showing her up. Now, going back to the runoff election, it's not just me projecting that Burt Jones would win, because if you go to the call sheet odds here, you can actually see that Burt Jones is projected to have a 71% chance of winning here. You can see here that in the days right before the primary election, it was sort of seen as a 50-50 between Rick Jackson and Burt Jones, because Rick Jackson was leading in the polls, and then right after the primary actually occurred and Burt Jones ended up overperforming, Burt Jones has been in the lead ever since, and currently he's at a 71% chance to win. So it's not just my opinion, but it's the general market consensus of $1.5 million that Burt Jones has a 71% chance to win. Now, once again, I think the margin here for the Republicans will be close and probably be within 5 points of one another. Now, finally, to end off the video, I wanted to cover the U.S. Senate runoff election in the state of Alabama. Now, this one's going to be very quick and short because there's only one race here, and that's between U.S. House of Representatives member Barry Moore, who is seen here as the MAGA candidate and part of the right wing of the Republican Party, facing off against a state candidate here, Jared Hudson, who's known more locally in the state of Alabama as opposed to in Congress. Now, you can see here that Barry Moore ended up getting a coalition of endorsements for pretty much the entire National Republican Party, whereas Jared Hudson got a lot more niche endorsements here from Tim Sheehy, Markwayne Mullin, and Riley Gaines. Now, you can see here Barry Moore was polling not so good in the initial primary, as he was seen in second place in a lot of the polls right behind Hudson. However, when the primary actually occurred, he ended up beating Hudson by more than 14 percentage points. Now, you would think if the polls underestimated him by 14%, the fact that he's now currently leading the polls by around 9 to 20%, depending on the poll, really shows that Barry Moore is pretty much locked up for a win here in this runoff election. I project that Barry Moore will be winning by around 10 percentage points against Jared Hudson here in my prediction for this runoff election that will occur later tonight. And finally, the market consensus here on call sheet is around $1.8 million, favoring Barrymore to win with an 84% chance. Now, with that being said, everyone, I hope you all enjoyed today's video. If you are new to the channel and haven't seen any of my other videos, please hit the subscribe button down below to keep up to date with all of my new content and new videos. If you have any video ideas or suggestions for content you want covered in my next and future videos, please leave it down below in the comments and I will be sure to get to it if I think that'll make a good video. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please drop a like. With that being said, I'll see you all in the next video.